When I was in college, I had to take an elective one semester. Well, one of the electives that was eligible that I could take was Appalachian Studies, so I took the class. I figured I would enjoy it. I didn't realize how much I would enjoy it, though. That was the first time that I really understood that Appalachia was the region that I lived in, and that we were slightly different maybe from other people, whether it was the food that we eat, the words that we said, the way we looked at life. That was my first indication, like, oh, everyone in the world's not like this. So I really enjoyed the class, and I learned a lot about various different parts of Appalachia. Well, in 2008, a long time after that, I kind of went through a rough patch of life and was looking for something to find my way again, to help me be happy again. Well, I was introduced to blogs. At that time, I thought all blogs were political in nature, and then when I discovered they were not, a good friend of mine, Dana Boyard, she had a blog, and when she kind of introduced me to hers, and that led to me finding other ones, so I began to think, well, what if I could do this? What if I could talk about Appalachia, talk about my culture? So that's when I started the Blind Pig and the Acorn in 2008. I'm still talking about it today. There's a lot to talk about when it comes to Appalachia. But even in those beginning years and weeks and months that I first started on the Blind Pig and the Acorn. So by that point, of course, I realized I live in Appalachia, and I'd really, in that time between college and the time between I started the blog, I'd read lots of books, I'd, watched lots of documentaries, that kind of thing, really immersed myself in it. But even at that point, I still didn't fully grasp the entirety of Appalachia, if that makes sense. Very early on in my blog, I did a video about the first 5 things, like a challenge, that when I challenged myself to think about Appalachia, what I thought about. And that was really an eye-opener and very interesting. A common question I get even today on these videos or on my blog is like, well, where is Appalachia? Where's it at? How do you know where it is? Is it just in one state? Is it in one county? Well, the Appalachian Mountains actually range or go from Canada all the way to Alabama, so it's a huge mountain range, huge. The Appalachian Regional Commission has a map that they use to signify the actual area of Appalachia. So that map is really interesting to look at, and when you look at it, you can see how very broad the area is, how very wide it is, how many people that actually is. Well, way back then when I was starting on the Blind Pig and the Acorn, I read so much stuff, and I read something by Michael Montgomery. He has since passed away. In later years, I got to actually know Michael a little bit, and he was the person who created the Dictionary of Smoky Mountain English. If you watch my videos, you'll be familiar with that dictionary. Anyway, but at this time, he was beginning to write and to learn about Appalachia himself. He was interested as a linguist about the language. That's what he was interested in. Well, he grew up in East Tennessee. But as he began to study and learn, see, he had in his mind, he'd kind of bought into some of the stereotypes, like Appalachia was this nether region. He wasn't sure where it was at, just somewhere up in the mountains. Well, he was really shocked, surprised, and I think pleased to find out, no, East Tennessee is Appalachia. He was right there in the heart of it, but he just didn't realize it because he'd kind of bought into some of those stereotypes that are abound everywhere. Not the bad ones, he hadn't bought into those, but still, even that, just thinking, well, that's somewhere else. That's different than where I'm at. When he found out, no, it wasn't, and go back to that map, that huge area, then you can begin to see there's so many people that watch my videos that are like, well, we do that too, but I'm in North Alabama, or I'm in North Mississippi, or wherever. Well, yeah, you do it too, because you're signified as being part of that region, and they took in a lot of different elements to develop that map. It wasn't just so much it's not just like you have to be in a mountain range that's part of the mountain range that's higher than a certain elevation or something like that. It spread into other areas where it was commonalities of the culture, the people, of course the landscape also, all that put together. But it's very interesting. People will say, well, you don't just talk like that in Appalachia, I talk like that too, and I'm in Alabama or wherever. Well, yeah. And even that, there's even people language and culture is not relegated to one area. We don't hold it in a lockbox. It can travel. So people travel out west. They take their language and their foods and their culture with them. And then if they stay there, I think that's the key really for the words, the culture, and those kind of things. The people living in Appalachia, a lot of it come with the settlers that come. Well, if a lot of people stayed in Appalachia because of different reasons, we could talk about that in another video, but so that those cultures were passed down, whether it was the words or the food or whatever. But yet if they moved on to Arkansas, on to Washington, wherever, and they stayed there for a long time, the same family did, then of course those same things were passed down in that family. So that's really amazing to think about. Anyway, back to my 5 things. So at that time, I thought, well, I should, I'm probably like Michael Montgomery. I've probably been, swayed by some of those stereotypes, not the bad ones. I know the people that live here. I know how good and decent they are. I know that so much of that stuff is just garbage and not any shred of truth to it. But so I thought, well, I'll challenge myself to think of the very first things, or to jot down the first things when I think, just try to clear my mind and think Appalachia, what comes to mind. So I did that. Well, it was surprising. So if you've been watching my videos, you know I come from a very musical family, very musical. But so you think, well, music would be one of the ones I thought of. The first thing that come to my mind was banjo. Now, I love the banjo. I'm all about the banjo, but no one in my family plays a banjo. No one, not one person. So why did banjo come to mind? That's interesting. The second thing I thought of was weathered barns. Well, yeah, weathered barns. You see barns driving up and down the road, I do, but weathered barns are everywhere. So why did I really think of that one? I'm not sure. I thought of quilts. Quilts are certainly part of Appalachia, but also lots of other areas. It wasn't really descriptive enough to be like if I'd come up with granny's quilts or something like that, but just quilts. I thought of that. I thought of cornfields, certainly cornfields. Corn was such a huge part of the Appalachian foodways, such a huge part of life, whether it was in a jar or it was on the cob or cut off or dried or fodder or whatever, a huge role. So that one kind of made sense. And then I thought of a granny lady in a long dress, like with an apron. Well, again, I had a Granny Gazzy, I had a Mama Marie, and then by this point, when Pap and Granny, they were my mother and father, but when their grandkids come along, we all started calling them Pap and Granny because the grandkids did. So I had lots of grannies in my life, and yet I thought of one that I don't have in my life with a long dress and an apron and a bonnet. So anyway, I found that really interesting. And back then I challenged my readers, if they would come up, leave a comment and you leave a list of clear your mind and see what first comes to mind when you think of Appalachia. And they did, and it was really interesting exercise. All these years later, after studying about Appalachia and fully immersing myself and realizing, at that time when I first started the blog and I would first think about Appalachia, I realized it was much more narrow, my scope was, like my family, my region, my county, my community here. And it was so eye-opening and encouraging and all that to when my blog began to gain traction, I got more people to read, to realize that someone that lived in Kentucky, West Virginia, wherever, and they'd never been here, I'd never been there. We had all these common things, whether it was the language, the foodways, the culture, the folklore, the gardening things that had been passed down. It was so amazing, so interesting, but so amazing that we shared that commonality of being in that same culture, even though we lived hundreds of miles apart from each other. We'd never met. I'd never been there. They'd never been here. Those kind of things. It was a really fascinating thing and hard to, in the beginning, for me to wrap my mind around. So anyway, my horizons of Appalachia certainly broadened over all the years that I've wrote about Appalachia and really tried to study the area, the culture, the people, all those kind of things. So today, when I challenge myself, first 5 things that come into mind when I think about Appalachia, my list is different than it was in those days. I think it's broader. I think I understand that it's larger than what my narrow focus, and my focus that was influenced by some stereotypes like Michael Montgomery's was. So my list of 5 things that come to mind when I think about the word Appalachia today are the landscape, the towering mountains and the deep dark hollers. That's what I think about, those mountains. Oh, they make my heart sing. So that's the number one thing that I think of when I hear Appalachia. I think about the mountains. I think about colorful people. I might ought to say colorful and resilient people. People in Appalachia can be so colorful. They're salt of the earth kind of people that would help you. Now, before anybody, of course, would say, you can't say that about everybody. You're absolutely right, I can't. There's people in Appalachia that are bad, just like there's people all over the face of the earth that are bad. But overwhelmingly, for the majority of people who live in Appalachia, they are colorful, resilient, good people. So that's the second thing that I think of. I think of the rich language. If you've watched my videos, you already know that I'm obsessed and in love with the rich, colorful language of Appalachia. I love the way that we speak. I love our accents. I love the words and the phrases and the sayings and all those kind of things. I'm just crazy about it. So that's the third thing that I think of. I think about the bountiful foodways. Again, if you've watched my channel, you know I'm all about the foodways. I think about those dishes that I grew up with Granny fixing, that now I fix for my kids, that when Granny was a girl, Granny Gazzy fixed for her. The things that Pap taught me to make, that his mother taught him, and probably her mother taught her, those bountiful, those foodways, that is just an amazing thing. And all cultures have them. It's just that I can only speak to my culture, which is Appalachia. But that's the fourth thing that I think of. And the last thing that I think of goes back to that banjo, but I don't necessarily think about banjo. I just think about traditional music. For us, our family, that definitely is the bass, the fiddle, the guitars, and mandolins. Those are the things that I'm most familiar with. But also I think of piano playing at church. I think of banjos, whether it's clawhammer or more the bluegrass style, all of it. I think of music. So you can see my list changed over the years. I want to challenge you that you would leave a comment below. Maybe you're one of those people that's never been to Appalachia. Maybe you're somebody that grew up like I did and you really have a fondness for it. Maybe you're somebody that's just always been interested in it. But leave a comment, and when you hear the word Appalachia, what are the 5 things that come to mind? Jot them down. Just jot them down. It's okay if some of them are like stereotype. You know, maybe I would be glad to tell you those are probably wrong. But if that's what comes to mind, write those down. You know, for some people, I'm sure it is. The way that we're often portrayed, I'm sure that those are some of the things that come to mind, whether it's real abject poverty, drinking, moonshine, all those kind of things. I'm sure that comes to mind for people, and that's fine. My channel is all about celebrating the positive things of Appalachia. So those are the things I like to focus on. There's bad in Appalachia just like there is the rest of the world, but my goodness, is there a lot of good too. A lot of good. Worth celebrating for sure. So please do that for me. Just a quick thing before I close. If you missed my video about gaining 100,000 subscribers, I still can't believe it. I'm still so honored, still so blown away that many people care to help me celebrate Appalachia. Please go back and watch that video, and maybe you'll enjoy it. It's got some music in it, some of that great traditional music, but also I've got some giveaways, and those have not closed yet. They won't close till next week, till October the 8th. Let me look back to make sure that I tell you the right thing. Of course, it's in the close on the October 19th. I was about to say 18th, so October 19th. So you've got the rest of this week to go do that. And the winners will be announced on my community tab of my channel, so you can check that out. But all that information is in that video. If you missed it, please go watch it, check it out. And as always, I hope you'll continue to drop back by often and help me celebrate Appalachia.